20 years ago, I was still a new immigrant to the United States. One day, as I was walking by a shopping center in my neighborhood, I stepped inside a bookstore and was overwhelmed by the quantity of books I discovered. Thank you. With my very limited English at that time, I walked through the table and shelves like a small child running in a candy store, trying to discover the content beyond those book covers. Thank you. On my way out of the store, but before exiting through the main gate, I looked behind one more time, glancing for a few seconds at the books and contemplating on the possibility that maybe one day my own book would be in display on one of these shelves. At that time, I wasn't known to the general public, but in the back of my mind, I knew that there was something important for me to deliver and share with others. Today, I have fulfilled that dream. And truthfully, the ability to accomplish my strong desire is in no small way the reason for my love and admiration for the United States, a land which, at least up to now, has championed the value of freedom, which grants me the ability to freely articulate my life experiences and my dissenting thoughts regarding Islam. Yet, it's clear to me that my story reflects on a religion, on a culture, customs, and deeds that are quite far removed and difficult to grasp by the average Western thinking person. For example, the status of women in the Muslim countries is a disaster that the world has overlooked for centuries, and an oversight for which it is now paying a high price. This is because an oppressed and subjugated woman cannot give birth to an emotionally and mentally well-balanced man. Likewise, when I think of my childhood and recall the incitement to hatred discharged by our teachers and clergymen, the vile allegations against Jews, Christians, and other non-Muslims, I can only conclude that if educated Muslims can replace the enormous hatred contained in our school books, both religious and secular, with subjects that focus on loving others regardless of their religion, race, or nationality, this is itself could potentially advance the Muslim world from its hunger, poverty, and ignorance. Reality demonstrates that the disrespect and intolerance taught in the Muslim world against the others very much devastates Muslims at least as much as it destroys their perceived enemies. So why did I pick the title A God Who Hates for my book? Obviously, having born and raised as a Muslim has played a major role in shaping my convictions regarding Islam. I have reached a point where I am certain that man internalizes the God he worships and eventually becomes his God. If you dive deeply into the Islamic text, including the Quran and the biography of Muhammad, you will find a deity whose countless actions and commands are comparable to those of jihadists. I believe that for a dramatic transformation of jihadists and their supporters into reasonable citizens of the free world, they must first face reality, see clearly, and deal with the nature of their fanatical interpretation of God. To prove my point, one of the countless encouraging letters I have been getting from Middle East readers is from a man in Saudi Arabia. The subject line of his email was, "From an ex-Wahhabi." He confessed to be totally transformed because he claimed that he has read my articles and was confronted by them with the truth regarding Islam. The 2006 Al Jazeera interview I gave introduced me to many people all over the world, including important media outlets like New York Times, Time Magazine, CNN, Fox News, and others. I received tremendous encouragement from countless readers and supporters, including from my Arab readers in the Middle East, to write a book about my viewpoints on life under Islam. Since then, I have been speeding up the process, but I found out that the subject matter has not been as easy as I thought at the beginning. Writing about my own suffering had been extremely draining and exhausting. In the last 3 years, I relived vividly and painfully the life I endured in Syria. My daughter Angela, who was born and raised in the United States, was the first one to read my book and provided me with a sense of how Western readers were going to react to the material I present. I still remember the days she came back from school, rushing to my computer to read whatever I had written that day, and hearing her screaming, "No way, Mom! Are you exaggerating? It's hard to believe it's true." Over time, I got tired of trying to convince Angela that unfortunately what I was describing was indeed my life. I fully understand that for Americans like Angela, who have never lived under repressive tyranny, it is difficult to fathom the extent of persecution in general and of women in particular, all sustained by the tacit approval of a hateful ideology. The story of my grandmother was the hardest for Angela to take. It was beyond her ability to comprehend the suffering my grandmother has undergone. In her early 20s, my grandmother already had 3 sons and 2 daughters. A smallpox epidemic swept through her village and carried off a large number of its inhabitants. It stopped at her door and took away her 3 sons, leaving only her daughters. You see, women have 9 lives. My grandfather awoke in the night to find himself enveloped not only in sadness, but in shame. He had become a father of daughters, and of course, my grandmother was held responsible for his disgrace, as she had borne him those daughters. My grandfather was the head of the village, and his position didn't permit him to remain without sons. Since he held my grandmother responsible for his disgrace, within a week of the death of her sons, my grandfather forced my grandmother to approach one of the village's best-known families and ask for their beautiful daughter's hand in marriage for him. By her own accounts, my grandmother made a good job of describing to the new bride my grandfather's virtues as a man of distinction, and she returned home with the new bride's family's consent. It was the custom for the bride to ride to the bridegroom's home on a horse, led by a member of her family. She would be met by a woman from the bridegroom's family who would welcome the bridal procession by dancing before it with a bowl of incense on her head. The bride would reward the woman by throwing a few coins into her bowl. My grandfather, without a thought for my grandmother's feeling, insisted that she carry the bowl and perform the dance before the bridal procession. He forced the woman who bore 5 of his children to humiliate herself before others in the village for the simple and selfish reason that he didn't want the few coins his new bride would toss into the bowl to go to anyone outside the family. My grandfather swallowed her pride and hid her sadness away to perform the dance. At the end of the wedding ceremony, she felt that although she might have lost her husband, she had at least gained a golden Ottoman pound. However, her happiness about even that small triumph was short-lived. At dawn, that first day, she awoke to the sound of a gentle knocking at the door of her room. When she spied my grandfather through a crack in the door, she was thunderstruck. In a low voice, he whispered in her ear, "My bride is still asleep, and I am here to borrow the golden pound. I promise I will give it back to you when we bring in the harvest at the end of the season." My grandmother gave him the coin and went back to her bed empty-handed, deprived of everything except her sadness. Some 50 years later, my grandfather died without having given my grandmother back her golden pound. My grandmother died about 15 years later, still insisting, as a loyal Muslim wife must, that her husband had been a man of distinction. And yes, this was a story my precious daughter, Angela, couldn't comprehend. Her great-grandmother's story. Such is my legacy. Now, America has reformed me, armed me with knowledge, clarified my vision and helped me to outline my plan to help liberate victims like my grandmother. I have decided to challenge and bring Allah to justice on serious charges like discrimination against women, against non-Muslims, and against anyone who dared to dissent. That there is a divine force is a proposition I wouldn't deny. However, the notion of a God who embodies the most vicious, hateful behaviors of the most corrupt human beings is not God at all, but a construct of the very flawed and depraved individuals who spoke him into existence as a means to serve their own agenda. A God who commands subjugation and the humiliation and destruction of non-Muslims is not a God whose commands are worthy of obedience, but a force that can only divide and generate hatred and intolerance among men. So I will continue to challenge the notion of such a God to the end of my life, with the hope that more and more lovers of freedom will join and unite in encouraging and supporting millions of Muslim women to voice their opposition and liberate themselves from their suffering. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.